say as closing opposition is that expression isn't valuable in itself. What's important, though, and what is valuable is the extent to which that expression allows you to achieve particular outcomes. Because expression isn't just about expression in itself, but it's about the outcomes that you achieve as a result of that expression. And what we would say, to the extent that you can convert those outcomes that you need to achieve via that expression, then that expression ought to be limited in those instances where those goals that should be achieved by expression are perverted. So things like information, discourse, and the kinds of things that we've already heard being thrown around in no particular framework in this debate. Right. So let's jump right into it, right? So you already heard from opening opposition about how it is that people react emotionally. And what we would say is that the particular point in this debate is that the documentary in itself is geared particularly towards that end, right? It's geared particularly towards an emotional reaction that people will react to. So when Josh asked you in this debate whether it is that you could have been foreseeing, we tell you that it is because that was it. It's supposed to be the shack value. It isn't about giving information. It's about presenting that information in particular types of way that make people react irrationally, right? The entire point of that documentary is to override your rational sensibilities, to cause you to react in particular ways in which you would ordinarily not. So when you ask the question of whether you'd be able to predict it, we say in closing opposition, you would, right? But particularly, we say that that's not the point of this debate, because this wasn't a preemptive ban on the video, right? It was an after-the-fact ban on the video when you'd already seen that it had violent implications. So the question isn't about whether you should be able to see that there'd be violence. You've already seen that there's violence. It was a good decision on the part of that government to then go ahead and ban the video, go away, right? So that's what we particularly tell you, right? So what we would say is that it's particularly important towards this is that the information that it gives people isn't information that people can rationally process, because that's the only extent to which information is valuable when it can rationally process it and make decisions from that. But it's something that tries to override your rationality to try and force you into particular types of decision. We tell you that in terms of providing the informing function of expression and people's right to listen, and whereas Josh will tell us, it doesn't provide that, because it essentially pushes people towards one thing, and we tell you that that in itself isn't legitimate, and we tell you that that's not the kind of informational right to hear that we would support. And Elisha and William are incredibly uncharitable in this debate, and they tell you that this is simply about trying to avoid mass PR scandal. Note that this wasn't about that, right? Look, we all have the information that violence and rape is wrong in India, and there is reporting on it. It's not an absence of information as far as that. We have bad information about rape in India, that's why we all know about it. But the point of the matter is, here there was a particular incitement of violence, and those are the things that they were geared at stopping. And then the question that gets asked in this debate, Mr. Speaker, is essentially about, when the state has failed to protect you, what is it that you ought to have recourse to? And what the government tells you, both in the POI from David and in Elisha's speech, is that it's okay to react violently to the extent that you've been unprotected. And what we would say is no, right? We say that it's particularly wrong to react violently because in that instance there's no due process that assures firstly that you're catching the right person, and secondly that you're meeting an amount of punishment that's fair in that instance, and that's what the process and the judicial process exists to encourage. And what we'd say is that the important thing to note here is that this involves state action. And we'd say that even if to the extent that state has failed, it has a responsibility for overall preservation of good conduct and law, right? So it doesn't, the state in itself ought to ban things that lead to bad outcomes from that state, because the state is responsible for preserving good conduct overall, right? The state is responsible for preserving good conduct overall, and what they simply tell you is that because I can protect you from being robbed, it's okay for you to go and rob or to beat up the person who's been robbed, but it's not okay for the state to further those messages, because those are the messages that that state in itself aims to protect. So we tell you that that's particularly important, and as far as this debate is concerned. Yes, Elisha.
You say the state should be able to do anything to further its own ends and cover up its own failures to protect people, but what about when the ends of the state are not protecting women, and that's what is in their suffering?
Look, your debate only happens, or your case is only right in an instance where there's an absolute lack of information, an absolute lack of ability to get that story out there. We tell you that the problem here isn't the information, but rather the presentation of that information, and as far as the debate is concerned, that's geared in particular ways, undermining your rational ability to process that information and process decisions around that issue, and that's particularly the point, right? You guys shoot for this because there's a sharp shock value that's associated with it. We tell you that that in itself, is not a good thing. We tell you that freedom of expression, again, isn't valuable in itself, but only in its ability to create good outcomes in terms of the things that it wants to realize. So the second thing that information tries to do is that it tries to get people to act in particular instances. The question again is this a good way for people to act? And what we would say is that no. And they consistently run this line that it's a good way for people to act violently. But for the reasons that I've already told you, it isn't a good reason to act violently. But they tell you that at the end of that violence, at the end of that anger, then you get discourse. Again, we say no. The point is that the discourse at the end of it becomes about the rationality of the ways that people reacted. And that's largely what a lot of that discussion is about, and about decisions about whether we ought to clamp down on those reactions or those particular reactions. I tell you that the overall reaction or the overall discourse that's created is often perverted in itself, not in particular ways that are good or that serve individuals. We tell you that the discussion in itself isn't pure discussion around the rape issue, but now you've gotten, and remember that you've gotten the information out there. It actually tells you, it allows us to sympathize. No, it allows that guy to get his views out there about how women ought to be raped to the extent where they walk around in miniskirts, right? And we tell you that that's something that people know, that people believe in, right? And to the extent that actually you believe in something that you sometimes agree with, that's cool, but you already know about that, and that's the point of this debate. So, Mr. Speaker, how is it that this debate ought to be judged? This debate ought to be judged around the types of speech that you want to protect, right? And is speech valuable in itself? And that's what essentially closing government tries to tell you. That speech is valuable just because it's speech and expression is valuable just because it's expression. And what we tell you on our opposition side is that that's not the point of speech. Speech isn't just about speech. It's about achieving particular outcomes in relation to actions and discourse. And we tell you that because of the particular ways that this makes people act, makes people react, makes people talk, we tell you that that's not a good thing to protect, and the government ought to be able to balance.